Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
I'm James Bays at UN headquarters in New York. She's just taken over one of the most challenging jobs in the world. The former Chilean president, Michelle Bachelet, is the new UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Khashoggi murder, the wars in Yemen and in Syria, and the plight of the Rohingya in Myanmar are among the top issues on her agenda. As the UN prepares to mark a key milestone, is the world backsliding on human rights globally? UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, talks to Al Jazeera. Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. We're going to talk about the concerns of human rights around the world now, but I'd like to start this interview by going back 70 years in history when this rather remarkable document was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Very briefly, tell me why this was important then and is still important now.
Well, you know, the world has gone through 2 world wars with all the consequences of it, and also gone through a very, I would say, grave economic depression. So everybody was saying, how can we ensure that this will never happen again? So they decided to set which were the principles and the main values that every human being should have, which were their main rights they should have everywhere. It doesn't matter where he lived, just for the reason to be human being. And that's the main issue. And it set a very set of standards that I think were important yesterday and continue to be important today. If you look at the world, some people could say, when you look so many news, terrible news many times, well, that was just a paper, nothing happened with it. But it's not true, because we have advanced on these 70 years. Still we have problems, but can't you imagine 70 years ago we had, in many places of the world, colonialism, slavery, apartheid. Women couldn't vote, only in some countries they could vote. I mean, there were women were dying while giving birth in thousands and thousands. Still we have the problem, but has diminished there. So there has been progress made. But
you say there's been progress,
yes.
But in recent years, have we been sliding backwards? Let me read you the words in one of his last speeches of your predecessor, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein. He said, "Oppression is fashionable again, the security state is back, and fundamental freedoms are in retreat in every region of the world." You face a big challenge.
As you know, multilateralism is under attack, and there are some pushbacks on human rights too. It gives me the impression that sometimes when some leaders of the world speak, relativizing human rights and saying that, or multilateralism, others feel like there's license to say it also. So,
particularly if the most powerful leader in the world, President Trump, is saying it.
Well, but I'm saying it many leaders, because sometimes, you know, when you see in some parts of Europe, for example, this anti-migrant tendency or xenophobia or anti-Islam or anti-Semitic beliefs, you feel that something has happened, even in countries you would never thought that. I mean, maybe we took for granted that much of the progress will be forever. And but I'm not pessimistic. I mean, I don't give up. I believe we need to push back on the pushback. We need to ensure that women's rights are really protected and ensured. We need to continue progressing that LGBTI people could love and live freely and without fear.
You say people want to live freely and in peace, but as a young woman, you couldn't do that under the dictatorship of General Pinochet in your country, Chile. I know that your father was arrested and died in custody. You and your mother were also arrested. Given that experience of a time of human rights abuse, how does that now help you do this job?
Well, the first thing I would like to highlight is that living and having been raised in a democracy, I took that for granted. I thought that was normal. Then when we had the experience of the dictatorship, we learned that that was not like that we needed to defend democracy to ensure that it could continue. I can tell a little anecdote. I had a meeting with some NGOs now as High Commissioner, and there was this people who asked the floor, and he said to me, "I'm so happy that you were in jail and tortured." So I say, "Come on." And I know what he meant. He meant I mean, we're not telling what happened to us to somebody who could understand it only sort of rationally or theoretically. I mean, you know what we're talking about. But on the other hand, I have had the other experience on being in office, on being in government. So I think both experiences bring me some understanding, profound and deep understanding of the complexities of these issues. On one hand, on the importance of respecting and protecting and promoting human rights, but on the other hand, I do understand how people make decisions, what are their obstacles sometimes, and how we can deal with that. How can I engage governments to solve those problems?
You probably get some understanding of some of the worst places on earth. For example, Syria. You read through this Universal Declaration, and you would not forgive the people of Syria for the last 7.5 years to say none of this applies to them. They have had an awful, awful time. Has the international community and the UN failed the people of Syria?
Well, you know, for me it's particularly painful because I was here at UN Women when this started, and I was so, like, because I'm a doer, of course I can think and have thoughts, but because I've been in executive power, I really like to think, how can we do things faster? How can we try to identify solutions that could permit, first of all, I would say prevent, because sometimes there are early warnings, and when you identify those early warning signs, if you have not only early warning signs, but early action, you could prevent. And so that's, for me, is, I'm not sure if you can say that the UN has failed. I think that everyone has failed. I mean, because it has been so complicated. I mean, the international community as a whole, it's not the UN, it's the international community, member states that are engaged with Syria on the different parts. So I feel that, I hope that soon that conflict ends it, because it has been so many casualties, not only deaf people, but also injured. And also, I mean, until now, you could tell there have been people killed because of airstrikes. And on the other hand, it says that allegations are done that in Aleppo, chemical weapons have been used again now from the armed non-governmental forces against civilians. So I think we need to work harder. I know the people who have been there on the ground, working, trying to do their best. We need to continue doing our best to stop that war from continuing.
And how do you get accountability for these awful crimes in Syria? Because since this was produced 70 years ago, we had another important development, which is the International Criminal Court, which came into being, or operation at least, about 15 years ago. And yet the route to that court is blocked. The Security Council, Russia and China have used their veto. Is there a problem here with accountability? And are you ever going to stop human rights abuses on this scale if you don't have accountability?
The thing is that even though we haven't had access directly to Syria, we have been monitoring from Lebanon. And so we have information that we have been sort of consolidating, and we have a lot of information that when the moment comes, either to national tribunals or international tribunals, or if the ICC it's considered under its jurisdiction, we will provide all that information. After a conflict in many countries, there comes a period of transitional justice. I mean, and that's very important to be able to ensure accountability mechanism. How that transitional justice goes, how it develops, will depend on each country. For example, Chile had one mode of doing it, South Africa had another, Colombia peace agreement had another, but there will be transitional justice, and there will be people held accountable. So
but on one side, one person has been in charge throughout this, President Assad.
Yes.
Do you think President Assad will stand trial eventually? Should he stand trial?
There should be accountable mechanisms that work in Syria, because not only governmental forces have done a lot of things, also ISIL and other armed groups. But what I do believe is that accountability is needed if you want a peace to be sustainable.
Given the appalling nature of what's been going on in Syria, it is quite awful to think that there's actually a country on earth where the humanitarian situation right now is even worse, and it's Yemen. Again, a man-made situation. Do you think war crimes have been committed in Yemen?
Yes, we think that has been. And we have had also, you know, a group of experts who have gone to Yemen, and they have identified some names of eventual perpetrators, and we have it under our security. We have it in a secure place. So in some minute, if again there will be accountability mechanism, and we could bring that information to the tribunals that will deal with it, and we'll continue working on that. Our group of experts has been renewed for 1 more year. We hope they have access to the ground, because sometimes the coalition has said that we have not been impartial. Our team, I mean, the experts are independent. They don't depend on us. We don't write the report, they write it. And they write it because they have interviewed many people, but they haven't have access to Yemen. So if they have access to the ground, and that is something I said to all member states who don't let us to go into it. If we have access to the ground, we'll be able to hear also your part. Otherwise, we'll have to report on the information we get. What I have already urged all the parties to stop these acts that produce so many civilian deaths and also starvation. I mean, 14 million people with famine in Yemen. So many children died of starvation.
We keep seeing in Yemen the coalition bombing medical facilities and killing children. Is this acceptable? Is their targeting acceptable?
Of course it's not. It's completely unacceptable. And that's why we have insisted to stop this, to avoid doing any act that could mean casualties on civilians and children. We have been calling all the parties to stop the restriction they are putting in terms that letting humanitarian forces go there with food or other supplies.
Of course, the coalition is led by Saudi Arabia, and I want to mention something else about Saudi Arabia, which is clearly the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Do you think, from all the information that's emerged, including the assessment by the CIA, that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was aware of the murder plot or even ordered it?
I cannot affirm it, neither discard it. What I think it's needed, it's an investigation with external investigators. I mean, the investigation done only by the Turkish and the Saudi government, it's something that people would not rely on it, on their findings. So we need a thorough, a deep and transparent investigation that gives us the whole picture, or who should be accountable, not only on the particular moment, but also in all the chain of order, if I may say.
Is it time for the UN to set up an investigation?
I think it is time. I mean, I don't have that in my mandate.
That would be the Secretary General to do that.
Well, I think they're looking at which are the best ways of doing it, but I think there should be an international inquiry, and because we cannot do criminal investigation, you need to be sure which are the mechanisms that can do that. I have asked the UN and Secretary General to look for which are the best mechanisms to go into it.
Another part of the UN human rights system, the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killing, Dr. Agnes Callamard, recently told me in her assessment that Saudi Arabia is culpable, whether the king knew, whether the Crown Prince knew, because of the suspects they have in custody. They were so senior, they had such an important role in the security sector in Saudi Arabia, that Saudi as a country is culpable. Do you agree with that assessment?
Probably yes. I mean, I know that, I think this is the kind of things that have led 3 of our special rapporteurs, the one on freedom of expression, the one on torture, and the one on extrajudicial killing, the one you just mentioned, to call for an international inquiry, because they think that probably it is culpable.
Are you worried that there will be pushback from Saudi Arabia, both on this case and on the war in Yemen? I'm going to recall to you something that you know very well, which is 2 years ago, the Children in Armed Conflict blacklist Ban Ki-moon, the then Secretary General, put the Saudi-led coalition on that list. They then threatened to pull out their money from humanitarian projects for the UN, and he had to take them off. Does this not, having done that, threaten the independence of UN human rights procedures?
You know, in the history of the UN, we have seen withdrawals of countries, of member states from some organizations, and also quitting the finance. But that shouldn't be taken as a way, I mean, it is a threat, but I don't think it should tie anyone's arms. And clearly for us, it won't tie our arms. We will do what we need to do. If we find out that there are some violations, clear violations of human rights that are verified and that we can identify the perpetrators, we'll do what we need to do. Because we cannot be tied because of those kind of threats.
This is a very live debate, as you know, here in the United States. And President Trump has made it clear that Saudi investment and trade is the most important thing. Does it worry you that the US is coming up with a position where money trumps human rights?
Unfortunately, money does have importance in many countries when they make those kind of decisions. I would prefer that ethics will be the way you define things in a country. And because I understand, I mean, any country and every country, even mine, we needed to trade, we needed to do a lot of things. But you also need to understand which are the limits, which are the red lines for it. So I know now there is a huge discussion in Parliament here about if continuing supporting and selling arms and so on. And I hope the institutional democratic institutions here define what's the best for the US interest.
But you know that President Trump does everything in a transactional manner. You talk about ethics and the ideals of this document, but I hazard a guess that President Trump has never read this, probably doesn't even know it exists.
Well, I cannot say that. I have no idea if he knows it or not, but of course he makes his decision in his own way.
But the US leadership on human rights from the very early days, 70 years ago, coming up with this, has been vital, has it not?
It has been, and Eleanor Roosevelt played a very important, I mean, she was not probably the only one, but she was one of the very important people in the drafting of that declaration. And in the history, the United States has been always very keen on championing human rights.
And do you think the change in US position potentially is emboldening other countries, whether it's Khashoggi, whether it's Russian agents using chemical weapons in the UK, or Israeli soldiers shooting at protesters on the Gaza border? People don't fear the backlash that perhaps they did in the past.
Well, the US as a country has been very important, has a big leadership and has been very influential with other countries, always. So of course it does have a consequence.
And one of those issues, of course, is migration. We've seen the US recently, the president, be very critical of those who are approaching the southern border, saying they're dangerous, they are terrorists. What does this make you think?
I believe that migrants can, and of course refugees that are in a very particular difficulty and they are asylum seekers, that people can contribute fantastically to every country. And they haven't done it here. They did it in my country and in many places of the world. Of course, countries have to deal sometimes with internal issues. They have to be able to develop some policies, to be able to, I would say, to be able to give those migrants a good possibility. I understand if tomorrow you are in a city and comes 5,000 people, you probably are not going to be able to accommodate it in the most perfect way. But so it's good to sort of have clear rules how to ensure that migration, that is a historic issue, is not just now, will be, the rights of the people will be protected. You can understand always in a huge group there might be some people who are not maybe perfect, or they even can have some not good records, but a huge majority are real normal people who are flying from violence, insecurity, poverty, and looking for other opportunities. And I'm really concerned, of course, that if what the presidential decision on putting armed forces on the frontier next to Tijuana, if that
and
happened,
using tear gas.
Yes, they're using tear gas, but now the presidential decision says that it could also be used lethal force in case that the patrols of the border will be endangered. And one of the problems is that when you have all those, when you have access to lethal force, sometimes we have seen in many parts of the world that they're used in a disproportionate way because the real threat is not as big as, you know, the result of using lethal force. So I'm really concerned. Are people there is on the ground, people from our office, Mexico, and people who we sent from Geneva to see what are the conditions of the migrants, and and they're reporting us daily on how things are developing.
You were one of quite a rare breed, which is a head of state, a world leader, but also a woman, which is a unique perspective. Among that very small club was, or is, the state councillor of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, who was a hero of the human rights world, a former political prisoner. Can I ask you, are you disappointed in her, given the violence that we've seen in her country, violence that may be on the edge of genocide?
I would have expected that she could be vocally and through actions try to do as much as possible to stop that violence against the Rohingyas from happening. I know that sometimes leaders cannot do everything because they don't have the whole power, but I believe, and I would have liked to see her standing up on those people's rights. And on the other hand, I would also call on countries who are thinking on repatriating those Rohingyas to Rakhine State again to hold up and not doing it because there are no conditions for them to come back. Their villages were destroyed, they don't have a house. Now we still have more than 100,000 of people there living in internal displacement, sort of in camps, in precarious conditions. And on the other hand, if you don't solve the root causes of the migration, I mean, it's very difficult for them to come back if they don't have free movement, if their rights are not respected. There's still violence and rapes going on there. And so we have made also a statement calling to Bangladesh to hold it still, the repatriation, because there are not conditions for them to go back there, and their human rights will continue being violated.
Let me take you at the end back to this document. 70 years ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 30 articles that outline all the rights that everyone on earth should have. I've been doing a somewhat unscientific straw poll of ambassadors here at the United Nations and asking them, if this didn't exist, if it was introduced now, would you get this through the General Assembly? And the rather sad conclusion of nearly everyone I've spoken to is probably not.
Well, I have to tell you that I have said the same in many meetings. I'm not sure it would be approved next week if it would be the needed signature of the declaration. But on the other hand, and because there are sometimes some false arguments that these are European values. I mean, first of all, these are main values for any human being. And second, the drafters, there was a commission not only of Europeans, of Western. No, there were Indians, there were Chinese, there were Latin American, there were people from all over the world. As a matter of fact, one Chilean one, Hernan Santa Cruz, was one of the important ones. And an Indian woman was, because, you know, it was written, not human rights. It says the rights of men, because at that time, men included women. I mean, not, but in the concept of the time. And there was this woman, Indian woman, she said, no, it has to be all human beings, because otherwise governments will use it against women to restrain their rights. So it's very interesting because sometimes it's used with false arguments. These are, but the sad story is that we wouldn't be able, maybe, to approve the same, maybe something a little bit different, but the same it wouldn't be, because there are so many arguments. Sometimes people justify human rights violations, saying because we're doing a counter-terrorist policy. Or other countries say, this is my sovereignty, so you don't have to come and interfere with my decisions. Or others who say, I have to feed the people first, then I have to care for their political and civil rights. And I do believe that the Universal Declaration and the human rights, even if there would be no Universal Declaration that exists, I believe they're all universal, they're all interdependent, and you cannot choose, okay, I will do 5, and next year I will do other 3, and so on. I mean, you may be going gradually, because every country don't have the money to sometimes ensure to everyone everything, but you need to know that human beings deserve all those rights to be respected, protected and promoted.
UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much.